Author, speaker, and educator. He's gone to school for over 15 years. He's earned 7 degrees. But even before Daniel was born, he was fighting for his life. So why don't we start at the beginning? Talking to you before, you said that even before you were born, your mother had to make a decision about your life. Why don't you tell me about that?
Yeah, well, I gotta tell you, I didn't have an easy start into this world, and it wasn't just the fact that I was born into North End of Hartford, into a life of poverty. It was before that. My life was in question, and it was a struggle before that, before I was even born. You see, the doctors told my mother that if you have this child will kill you. And I talk about that sometimes, and it's just like, how do you even make that decision? It's like your life, the baby's life. Your life, the baby's life. I mean, how do you make that decision? Would any of us even know how to make that decision? But my mom did. And she made that decision. She decided to have me. She didn't listen to the experts. She decided to have me. So, right from the get-go, I guess I wasn't supposed to be here. And I am. I made it. And so did my mom. My mom made it through that too. So I guess sometimes, you can't always listen to the experts. Sometimes you got to do your own thinking, your own thing, your own living, and do what you think is right. My mother thought it was right for her to have me, and here I am, all these years later, thanks to her.
So how would you describe your mother?
If I was going to describe my mother, I would say that she had to be a saint, but one of the toughest saints I've ever met. Now here's a woman that had 7 kids. And rough pregnancies were all 7, and had a husband that was a little bit old-fashioned, a man's place is not to help around the home, and that's a woman's job, and the woman takes care of the kids and takes care of the home and does all that. The unfortunate side of that is that my father struggled with making a living, and my mother also became the breadwinner. So there she was working all night long on the 3rd shift, the graveyard shift, so she could bring home a paycheck for us kids. And then all day long, she had to take care of 7 kids. And in between that, her life wasn't easy. Sometimes my father would try to scare her into not going to work. Try to sometimes take her car keys away or push her around a little bit and tell her she couldn't go to work. And if she didn't go to work, we didn't eat. So imagine being in that situation. You're tired, taking care of 7 kids all day. That really wears you out. And you got 7 kids just at you everywhere. And you probably just want to go to bed. And it's like, oh no, you're going to go to work now. And then you got a husband that's saying, oh no, you're not. You're not going to work. And he's trying to do things that keep you from going to work. And if you don't go to work, your kids don't eat. You don't get to keep your home. Well, those are like impossible circumstances that my mom lived under, and yet she did it, day after day, year after year after year. She somehow did that, and people can say, oh, well, and some people have said, Dan, you didn't always have a lot of supervision growing up. You did things that you'd never let your kids today do. Well, hey, it was a different world back then, for one thing. And the second thing is, what kind of supervision would any mother be able to give, under those circumstances? She gave us good supervision for what she could do between, working all night long and running 7 kids around with practically no help.
How did you feel about your father?
Well, I tell you, when I was younger, I had a lot of mixed emotions about my father. Most of what I felt about my father was fear, because my father would come home late at night after being at the bar for a few hours, and he would come home angry. And there weren't many nights that went by that my father didn't get rough with my brother. And then my mother tried to stick up for him, and he'd get rough with my mother. And if I happened to be in the vicinity, he'd get rough with me. You know, many times I was just trying to hide under the covers of my bed. So in my early years, it was fear. And it was fear for a lot of years of my father. I was afraid of him. He was a hard-hitting, hard-drinking Marine. So I was afraid of him. And as I got older and got into sports and lifting weights and started getting stronger, there was a couple times that fear turned into anger. And there was a couple times where I felt like returning some of the behaviors. But I didn't. As I got older again and went into adulthood, and something that stuck with me through the years is, you know what? Perhaps my father did the best he could with the tools he had to work with at the time. I mean, now he's an older man, he's in his 70s, and me and my father talk at least every few weeks. We talk on the phone. I stop by and bring him a newspaper, you know, usually one that's got one of my weekly newspaper columns that I write in it. But I stop by, bring him my newspaper column, we talk. You know, he's taken an interest in the educational world. He asks me about teaching, and you know, he pays attention about what's going on. He reads the newspapers and stuff, and you know, he asks me questions about it. So it's like we have a relationship now. And I think back and I say, well, here's a man that grew up under very difficult circumstances. His father died when he was young. You know, he lived. His parents lived through the Great Depression, so his parents still had some of that Great Depression mindset. He was born right before World War II was his formative years. His father passed away. He got a stepfather that was rough with him. And at 17 years old, he ran away from high school to go join the Marines. You know, that's not exactly the most comfortable place to go to, the Marines. And then when you're in the Marines, of course, you know, one of the things that happens sometimes in the Marines is, you know, you hang out with the guys, you drink a little bit. So, you know, sometimes you come out of the Marines and you're still drinking. And you got this mentality that things are going to be, you know, the Marine way or your way, or, you know, you're not going to accept anything else. So I think maybe my father, you know, although I could not understand it at the time, and, you know, and I had feelings of the fear and the anger, and then later on, my feelings about my father turned to something else, maybe like acceptance. You know, like, what would I have done under those circumstances that he lived? Would I have turned out different if I was born in 1938 under the same circumstances, the same home that he was? And this is something that's been reinforced as an inner city school teacher.
What would you say that you learned from your parent, whether good or bad, when you think about them, whether it's your father or your mother? What lessons would you say that you took away from growing up in that household?
Well, I would say growing up in the home that I grew up in taught me a lot of different lessons. You know, one is opposites attract. My mother was all giving, and it seemed like and kind to a fault. Whereas my father seemed like maybe like more of a taker and more of a hard man. So I mean, I guess opposites do attract, and sometimes you really do many times become a product of your environment. You know, my mom grew up in a different home than my father, so you become a product of your environment. And you know, my father grew up the way he grew up, a lot of it because of his home. I think about me and my brother grew up in the same home, and this was a lesson that I learned. And granted, he was a little older than me, and he got a little rougher than me. I'll always admit that he got a little rougher than me. But we grew up in the same home, so you would think that we would have turned out somewhat similar. Well, what I've learned is that that's not true either. You know, a lot of life is a choice. A lot of life is a choice. You know, and you could just take what you've been handed, and you know, and accept that you've been beat up, and then turn into that angry, mean person. Or you could do something different. You can make a conscious choice and do something different. You know, like that's what I did.
Daniel grew up in the streets of Hartford, where he experienced reverse racism. When did you realize that life was a choice and that your choices would affect your future or your life?
I don't know if there was any one moment where I realized that life was a choice. It might have been like a process of this developed over the years. Or maybe the choices I was making was subconscious. Maybe it took years for me to figure out how to consciously make choices. But I knew in my life that I always wanted something better. I was living in fear, living in poverty, living in racism or reverse racism, very stressful upbringing. And I knew that I wanted something different. I knew that there had to be something better out there. So maybe I was subconsciously making that choice, that there was something better out there, and I was making that choice to work toward it. But over a process of many, many years, and being curious about successful people, I finally got to the place where I started reading, which is funny because when I was younger, I wasn't into reading. I was into playing sports, and I thought reading was maybe more for girls than boys. Boys did things like went out and played tug of war, wrestled on the grass or something like that, So, but I started reading about all these successful people. And as I was reading about these successful people, not only did I do that, but I also got turned on to section 158 in the library, which is the psychology section. So I started reading a lot about the psychology of winning and what these successful people do. And I started noticing that pattern. And over and over and over, these successful people kept saying that it was a choice. It's a choice. So there I was, finding that maybe for the first time for real, as a conscious choice from the books that I was reading. I wasn't surrounded by real high-quality people, at least not in the beginning.
What age were you when you started reading those psychology books and found that section in the library?
I gotta admit, I was a late bloomer when it comes to reading books and finding my way, or at least my initial way, through books. I was definitely a late bloomer. I'd say, believe it or not, it was college, which is kind of sad to think about it. It took me all the way to my college years. I was a young man before I really started reading books. In high school, I tried to avoid it. Middle school, I tried to avoid it. High school, I tried to avoid it. I just wanted to play sports, hang out with my buddies, talk to them, try to get a little, maybe a date every once in a while. I really wasn't into reading books. I just really didn't think it was manly, which is something I learned. And then when I got to college, I learned that first I was forced to start reading and start reading like crazy in college. And I had a lot of ground to make up. And as I made up that ground and got better and better at reading, somehow this other interest developed that maybe I shouldn't just read textbooks. Maybe there'd be something else out there that might be good to read too. And then that's when I started reading about successful people. I started going through like the biography section of the library and reading about these people, and then that really got me excited. And one of the first books I read, that was kind of falls into this like biography, sort of like psychology of winning. I read a book by Tony Robbins, and in his book, I just loved what he talked about. Setting these goals and using transformational vocabulary and choosing. Making a conscious choice to be a winner. Talking about the difference between two young men today and those same two men 10 years from now will be the books that they read and the people they talk to. I still think about that. I still write about that in my articles and my books. That the books that I've read and the people that I've talked to have made all the difference, and it can't for anybody out there.
Growing up in the mean streets of Hartford, Daniel had a lot of fights with the neighborhood kids. Tell me about growing up in East Hartford.
Oh, gosh. Growing up in East Hartford was great in a lot of ways. And then in other ways, it was very rough. I just came over from Hartford. I lived in Hartford the first 7 years. And it was rough over there, so I came over to East Hartford, and and I was still in that rough, like street-wise, street rough and tough mentality when I came over to East Hartford. So in the beginning, I was getting a lot of fights in East Hartford, getting into some trouble. I wasn't doing well in school, so it was rough there. But where it got good was that I joined the football team. And during those days, I was talking back in the 80s, during those days, just East Hartford had 4 town football teams. So it was a big interest in football, and they did a good job. So I played football, and I started funneling a lot of my extra energy as a boy. Maybe a little bit of my anger. Just the things that, being a boy, just the boyness. I started funneling that into football. And my football team was awesome. And we did really well. We won a lot of games. So that gave me some self-esteem and some confidence that sports is like a pretty cool way to go. And then when I was in 8th grade and I was on that championship football team in 8th grade, I was lucky to have one of the guys on the team be a wrestler. And his father was a wrestler. And his father was like, "Dad, I want to take you down to a wrestling practice because I think you'd be really good at it." And thank God he did, because some of my best memories in East Hartford were of playing football and wrestling. Well, I went on to become a 2-time state champ and a 2-time junior Olympian in wrestling right out of East Hartford. So I got a lot of fond memories of East Hartford, but it didn't start off so easy.
When we spoke, you said that one of the things that you struggle with, even I believe when you were growing up, is feeling that you weren't good enough. Where did that belief stem from? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's funny. I meet a lot of people that tell me, "Wow, you've done some amazing things. How did you do these amazing things?" And I don't always have an easy answer for them. And upon thinking about it over the years, I think that maybe sometimes, although it's kind of sad to say this, sometimes maybe some of my driving force comes from feelings of insecurity. And when I think about where did those feelings come from, those feelings of insecurity come from, and I believe it must have came from my formative years. I was born in Hartford, the north end of Hartford, and I lived the first 7 years there. We were the only white family in the neighborhood, so we felt a lot of racism or reverse racism, where they were always calling us, racial names and chasing us and wanting to beat us up and stuff like that. My father was an abusive alcoholic, so I was living in fear. It was very, under stress, extreme stress. And I was living, we didn't have much money. We were living in poverty. So if you think about it, you got someone who's living in poverty, someone who's living in stress and fear, and someone who's living in a community of racism against them because they're different. They're different skin color. Those 3 things really wear on you and really beat you up and tear you down and really make you wonder if you're any good. And then you take that and then that's what you bring into your teen years and your adult years.
Daniel is an award-winning author. He's written a trilogy on teen leadership, Granddaddy's Secrets, emphasizing how a teen can succeed in an imperfect world. You also said that during your formative years that they told your mother that you were deaf and mute. Was that when you were younger? Do you remember that?
When I was little, my mother tells me a story that I don't remember, and now my mother's not around for me to ask her to give me more details on it. But my mother told me a story when I was little that one day I came to her with a bellyache. I was holding my bellyache. I was telling her I had a lot of pain in my bellyache. And then that basically is going to a different story that I haven't told you yet, which maybe I'll piggyback on this other one. But I just wanted you to know, I had some issues as a kid. I went into a coma and almost didn't come out of it. And then it was another time when my parents found out that I was deaf and I was making, just like mute noises. I couldn't speak words or sound like a human. I was just like animal noises. So my parents brought me to a specialist who said that I needed an ear operation to restore my hearing, but unfortunately it'd be too late for me to ever speak again. I would do nothing but make animal noises the rest of my life. And my parents brought me to this little nun. This little old nun, I don't remember a whole lot about her. And she brought me to this little nun, and I don't know if it was once a week or 5 times a week. I don't remember how many times a week it was. But I remember I went to her and she got me to talk. So now today I can hear, I can speak, and I speak a lot. And that illness that I had that stemmed from the bellyache, when I went into a coma, and a lot of other kids that had circumstances that were similar didn't make it. I asked my sister what that was about. My older sister said it was meningitis. I went to a coma meningitis. I came out of that. So you throw these, this was a rough beginning. The doctors told my mother that she was not to have me. Then I get meningitis, and I'm deaf and mute, and I'm living in poverty, and I'm living under stress and abuse, and I'm living in like a community of like racism because I'm the white person, the only white person, and all these things just really, really beat you up and really tear away your self-esteem and your self-worth. But at the same time, remember before I talked to you about life is a choice? So I can make that choice. That, wait a minute, if I got through all this stuff at just a little tight, then I must be here for something important. I must be here for something really important. Because I got off to a rough start, rough start. And now, maybe that's why I get such a big heart to kids that are struggling. Today, maybe that's why I became a school teacher. Maybe it was like some kind of driving force. Maybe that's why I've written teen leadership books to help kids that I'm never going to be standing in front of them. And they can read my books. Maybe that's why I've created a website and a blog, and a vlog that talks to kids that I may never be standing in front of. Kids that are struggling. Maybe I can help them.
Did wrestling save your life?
I think wrestling did more good for me than I could ever maybe truly understand. It took me off the streets. It took me off street fighting and put me on the mat, on the wrestling mat, to fight on the wrestling mat and to not get arrested like so many of my friends. So many of my old friends in my old neighborhood are dead or in jail. So many of them. It's amazing. I'm like one of the few kids that got out of my neighborhood. And I think wrestling was a huge part of that. While my friends were still street fighting, my brother included, while he was still street fighting and while they were being thrown in jail, I was fighting on the wrestling mat and getting patted on the back and getting my hand raised and getting trophies. And it was like really cool to be getting trophies for like fighting and being good at it. I was lucky enough, I don't know if lucky is the right word, I talk about that in my books, but I made the varsity team as a freshman from someone that's never wrestled before. So I came out to the wrestling team and I made the varsity team. And people were like, how? How did you make the varsity team? And, were you natural? I said, maybe. Maybe I was natural. Maybe a lot of it came down to just the physical ability I had because I lifted weights. Maybe some of it came down to that street fighting that I grew up in, that environment that I grew up under, that really toughened me up. And some people could say, it's sad that you had such a tough upbringing. But maybe if I didn't have that tough upbringing, maybe I wouldn't have been wrestling varsity as a freshman. And maybe I wouldn't have been a 2-time state champ. Maybe I would have been a middle-of-the-road wrestler. Maybe I wouldn't have been a 2-time junior Olympian, and a decade later, twice the coach of the Junior Olympics. So maybe I need to go back and thank my circumstances and be grateful for my upbringing because it made me tough, and it made me who I am today.